There are moments in life that arrive quietly without dramatic music or warning signs. Moments that look so ordinary from the outside that no one would ever guess they contain the power to break something open inside you, to shatter a version of yourself you didn't even know you were performing. And this is a story about one of those moments, about a lunch that became a mirror, about declined credit cards and accusations and the strange, terrible weight of being blamed for something that reveals a much deeper truth about how we've been living, about the roles we've been assigned, about the silent contracts we sign without reading them, and about what happens when we finally start to see. Her name was Carmen, and she was 34 years old when it happened, married for 6 years to a man she loved but didn't always understand. A man whose mother had a way of taking up all the oxygen in every room she entered. And Carmen had learned, the way so many women learn, to make herself smaller, to smile through discomfort, to prioritize peace over truth, to swallow her feelings like bitter medicine, because that's what good daughters-in-law do. That's what loving wives do. That's what women who want to keep their families intact do. And she had been doing it for so long that she barely noticed the weight of it anymore. The way her shoulders stayed tense, the way her stomach knotted before every family gathering, the way she rehearsed conversations in her head, trying to predict where the landmines were buried. The lunch happened on a Saturday in April, one of those bright spring days when the world feels full of promise, when the light comes through restaurant windows in golden streams and makes everything look softer, kinder, and they had gathered at an upscale bistro. Carmen and her husband Daniel and his mother Victoria and his younger sister Alina. 4 people at a table meant for celebration but already humming with the kind of tension that lives just beneath polite conversation. And Carmen could feel it in her chest, that familiar tightness, that sense of walking on glass, because Victoria had opinions about everything, about the menu, about the service, about how Carmen was dressed, about why they hadn't visited more often, about how marriage was supposed to look and feel and function. And Carmen had learned to nod, to agree, to deflect, to survive. They ordered appetizers and wine, Victoria insisting on the most expensive bottle because she believed in treating herself well, because she worked hard and deserved nice things. And Carmen watched her mother-in-law's face as she studied the menu, the way Victoria's mouth tightened when she disapproved of something, the way her eyes swept over Carmen with that particular mix of scrutiny and dismissal that made Carmen feel simultaneously hypervisible and completely unseen. And Daniel was doing what Daniel always did, trying to keep everyone happy, trying to smooth things over, making jokes that landed awkwardly. And Alina was on her phone, half present, and Carmen felt that old familiar feeling, the one that whispered, "You don't really belong here, you're always going to be the outsider, you're always going to be the one who has to prove yourself." The meal progressed with its surface-level pleasantness, conversations about work and weather and neighborhood gossip. And Carmen played her part beautifully, asking the right questions, laughing at the right moments, complimenting Victoria's new haircut even though it looked identical to the old one, and she could feel herself performing, could feel the exhaustion of it, the way she was monitoring every word, every expression, every gesture, making sure she didn't accidentally trigger one of Victoria's many sensitivities. And there's something profoundly lonely about sitting at a table with people you're supposed to love and feeling like you're on stage, like you can never relax, like one wrong move will confirm everything they secretly think about you. When the bill came, Daniel reached for it automatically, the way he always did, the way Victoria expected him to, because that's what good sons do. They take care of their mothers, they show respect through generosity. And Carmen watched as he pulled out his credit card, watched as the server took it away, watched as the minutes stretched out, and then the server returned with that apologetic expression, that slight embarrassment, and said quietly that the card had been declined. And Carmen felt something shift in the air immediately, felt the temperature drop, felt Victoria's attention sharpen like a blade. Daniel tried another card, his face flushing slightly, that particular male embarrassment about money and provision and not being able to pay. And Carmen knew their finances were tight, knew they'd had unexpected expenses that month, knew that Daniel had been stressed about work, and she reached into her purse, pulling out her own card, offering it with a small smile, trying to normalize it, trying to make it no big deal. but Victoria's face had already changed. Had already arranged itself into that expression Carmen knew too well, that mix of disappointment and judgment and barely contained anger. The second card was declined too, and then Carmen's card, and in that moment, in that terrible suspended moment of public humiliation and confusion, Carmen felt something break open inside her chest, felt panic and shame and a desperate need to fix this, to make it okay, to prove that they weren't irresponsible or careless, that this was just a mistake, just a technical error, just something that could be explained away, and she could feel Victoria's eyes on her, could feel the weight of that gaze. And before Daniel could try to sort it out, before anyone could speak rationally about calling the bank or using a different payment method, Victoria leaned back in her chair and said, in that tone that was somehow both casual and cutting, "Well, I suppose this is what happens when you don't manage your money properly, isn't it, Carmen?" Not a question, a statement, and Carmen felt those words land in her body like a physical blow, felt them register in her nervous system before her conscious mind could even process them. Because Victoria hadn't said you both, or you two, or even looked at Daniel, she had looked directly at Carmen, had aimed that blame like an arrow, had made it clear exactly who she held responsible. And Carmen opened her mouth to respond, but nothing came out, nothing but a small, wounded sound. And she watched Daniel's face, waited for him to say something, to defend her, to correct his mother, to point out the obvious unfairness of that statement. But Daniel was looking down at his phone, already calling the bank, and Alina was still scrolling through something, and Victoria was sitting there with that satisfied expression, that look that said, finally, finally the truth comes out, finally we can all admit what I've always known. The moment stretched and compressed simultaneously, the way traumatic moments do, the way your brain tries to protect you by slowing everything down and also speeding it up. And Carmen could feel her amygdala firing, could feel her body flooding with cortisol, that ancient stress hormone that doesn't distinguish between physical danger and social humiliation, that responds to rejection and blame with the same intensity it would respond to a predator. And her hands were shaking slightly as she gripped her purse, and she could hear her own breathing, shallow and quick, and she could feel tears threatening at the corners of her eyes, and she knew with absolute certainty that if she cried now, if she showed any emotion, Victoria would use it as further evidence of Carmen's inadequacy, would frame it as dramatic or oversensitive or proof that she couldn't handle adult responsibilities. Daniel managed to sort it out. Turned out there was a fraud alert on one of the accounts. A simple technical issue that was resolved with a phone call, and Victoria's sister who lived nearby came and paid with her card. And everyone laughed awkwardly and said how silly it all was, how these things happen, but Carmen couldn't laugh, couldn't pretend, couldn't perform anymore because something had fundamentally shifted. Something had been named that couldn't be unnamed, and as they left the restaurant, Victoria pulled Carmen aside with that false sweet smile and said quietly, "You know, I wasn't really blaming you, darling. I was just making an observation. You're so sensitive sometimes. You really need to develop thicker skin if you're going to be part of this family." And Carmen felt those words wrap around her throat like hands. She didn't speak on the drive home, and Daniel asked if she was okay. And she said yes automatically, reflexively, the way she always did. But inside she was screaming, inside she was finally starting to see the pattern, the script she'd been following, the role she'd been assigned. And that night, lying in bed next to her sleeping husband, Carmen stared at the ceiling and let herself feel what she'd been pushing down for 6 years. Let herself acknowledge the rage and hurt and exhaustion and profound loneliness of being blamed, of being scapegoated, of being the designated problem in someone else's narrative. And she realized that the declined credit cards weren't the real disaster at all. The real disaster was how automatically she'd accepted Victoria's blame, how quickly she'd internalized it, how ready she'd been to believe it was somehow her fault. This is where the deeper story begins, where we move beneath the surface of what happened at that lunch and into the vast, complex territory of family dynamics and assigned roles, and the ways women are taught to carry blame that doesn't belong to them. Because Carmen's story isn't unique. Carmen's story is happening in millions of families right now, in countless restaurants and living rooms and holiday gatherings. Wherever women are being held responsible for maintaining peace at the cost of their own dignity, Wherever mothers-in-law and daughters-in-law are locked in ancient power struggles that neither of them fully understands, wherever love and control get confused, wherever one person's need to be right requires someone else to be wrong. Let me tell you about Isabel, who was 41 when she finally understood why every family dinner left her feeling depleted, why she always seemed to be the one who had done something wrong or said something inappropriate or failed to meet some unspoken standard. And Isabel's mother-in-law had a particular talent for rewriting history, for taking any conflict or problem and somehow, through an almost magical process of distortion, making it Isabel's responsibility. And Isabel had spent 15 years trying to be good enough, trying to anticipate needs, trying to prove her worth, trying to earn approval that was never actually available. Because the system wasn't designed for her to succeed, the system was designed to keep her in a one-down position, to maintain a hierarchy where her mother-in-law remained central and Isabel remained peripheral, probationary, always on trial. Isabel described a Christmas when the turkey had burned because her mother-in-law had insisted on a particular cooking method that Isabel knew wouldn't work but agreed to anyway because she'd learned that disagreeing was worse than failing. And when the turkey came out dry and overcooked, her mother-in-law had looked around the table with theatrical sadness and said, "Well, I tried to help, but some people just won't listen." And Isabel had felt that familiar confusion. That disorientation that comes from being blamed for following someone else's instructions. That gaslit feeling of being told that what happened isn't what actually happened. And she'd apologized, had taken responsibility, had spent the rest of the day trying to make up for it. And it was only years later in therapy that she began to understand what was really happening. From a neuroscience perspective, what happens in these dynamics is fascinating and devastating because our brains are wired for attachment, wired to seek belonging and approval from our tribe. And when we enter a partner's family system, especially as women, we often arrive with an unconscious expectation that we will be welcomed, accepted, integrated, but family systems are conservative by nature. They resist change. They have established roles and rules and power structures, and a new member, especially one who claims the attachment and attention of a central figure like a son, represents a threat to the existing order, represents a potential disruption, and the system will often work, unconsciously and sometimes quite consciously, to manage that threat, to put the newcomer in her place, to establish the hierarchy clearly. When Victoria blamed Carmen at that restaurant, when she made that comment about money management, she wasn't really talking about finances, she was talking about power. She was talking about who gets to define reality in this family, who gets to assign responsibility, who gets to be blameless and who gets to carry shame. And blame is one of the most powerful tools in family systems, because it's a way of externalizing discomfort, of taking the anxiety or stress or disappointment that exists within the system and locating it in one person, making that person the problem, the reason things don't work, the explanation for why everyone else feels bad. And once you're cast in that role, once you become the designated problem, it's almost impossible to escape it. Because everything you do will be interpreted through that lens. Every action will be evidence of your inadequacy. Every mistake will confirm what everyone already knows. Carmen told me later, months after the lunch, after she'd started therapy and begun the long process of disentangling herself from the story Victoria had written about her, that she'd spent years believing something was fundamentally wrong with her, believing she was the reason family gatherings felt tense, believing she was too sensitive, too difficult, too much of everything and not enough of what mattered. And this is what scapegoating does. This is its most insidious function. It makes the scapegoated person doubt their own reality, doubt their own perceptions, doubt their own worth, and Carmen had been carrying that doubt like a stone in her chest, letting it shape how she moved through the world, how she spoke, how she loved, how she existed in her own marriage. The concept of the scapegoat comes from ancient ritual, from the practice of symbolically placing a community's sins and failures onto a goat and driving it into the wilderness, sending away the bad things so the community could feel clean and righteous and united. And this practice persists in families, in organizations, in cultures, wherever there's a need to maintain an image of goodness by locating all the badness somewhere else. And women, particularly women who marry into families, are often assigned this role, become the repository for everything the family doesn't want to acknowledge about itself. The disappointment, the dysfunction, the unmet needs, the unprocessed grief, all of it projected onto the daughter-in-law who then carries it, who then becomes the explanation for why things feel wrong, why the sun is distant, why holidays are stressful, why nothing feels quite right anymore. Let me tell you about Patricia, who was 38 when she realized she'd been playing this role in her husband's family for 12 years. And Patricia's awareness came not from one dramatic moment, but from an accumulation of small moments. Moments when she noticed how her sister-in-law never got blamed for being late, but Patricia did. Moments when she saw how her mother-in-law's criticisms of her were constant and varied, while her brother-in-law's wife seemed to move through family events untouched by judgment. And Patricia started keeping a mental inventory, not out of bitterness but out of confusion, trying to understand why she always seemed to be the problem. And what she discovered was that she'd been cast in a role before she'd ever even met these people, that her husband's family needed someone to be the outsider. Needed someone to absorb their collective anxiety, and she had walked into that role unknowingly, innocently, and had spent over a decade trying to perform her way out of it, not understanding that the role wasn't about her behavior at all, it was about the family's need to have someone in that position. Patricia described a particularly painful Thanksgiving when she'd worked for days preparing dishes, trying to contribute, trying to show care, and her mother-in-law had taken one bite of Patricia's green bean casserole and made a face and said, "Well, this is certainly different," with that tone that made different sound like a diagnosis of failure. And Patricia had watched as her mother-in-law pushed the dish away, barely touched, and later that evening. Patricia overheard her mother-in-law telling another family member that some people just don't have a natural touch in the kitchen, and Patricia had felt something crack inside her. Felt the futility of it all because she'd followed her mother-in-law's recipe exactly, had made the dish precisely as instructed, and it still wasn't right, it still wasn't good enough. And that's when Patricia began to understand that the problem wasn't actually the green bean casserole. The problem was that no matter what Patricia did, it would never be right because being wrong was her assigned function. Our nervous systems are exquisitely sensitive to rejection and exclusion. Because for most of human history, being expelled from the tribe meant death, meant you couldn't survive alone, and so we've evolved to be hypervigilant about social belonging, to monitor constantly for signs that we're valued or devalued, accepted or rejected. And when we experience repeated criticism, repeated blame, repeated messages that we're not quite right, our bodies respond as if we're in danger, flooding us with stress hormones, activating our threat detection systems, making us hypervigilant and anxious and desperate to fix whatever's wrong. Except that in these family dynamics, nothing is actually wrong with us. We're responding rationally to an irrational situation. We're trying to solve a problem that can't be solved because we're not the problem, we're the solution to someone else's problem, we're the container for their discomfort. Carmen's therapist helped her understand something crucial, helped her see that her mother-in-law Victoria was operating from her own wounds, her own fears, her own unprocessed losses, and that Victoria's need to control and blame and diminish wasn't really about Carmen at all. It was about Victoria's terror of being replaced, of losing centrality in her son's life, of becoming irrelevant, of aging and being left behind. And Victoria had never learned to process those feelings directly, had never learned to grieve or adapt or accept change. And so she managed her anxiety by controlling Daniel, by maintaining her position as the primary woman in his life. And Carmen represented a threat to that position. Carmen represented everything Victoria feared: youth and partnership and the natural process of a child growing up and choosing their own family. And so Victoria had to diminish Carmen, had to make Carmen small and wrong and inadequate. Because that was the only way Victoria knew how to feel secure. Understanding this didn't make it hurt less, Carmen told me, but it changed the quality of the hurt, changed it from something is wrong with me to something is happening that isn't about me. And that shift, that reframing, was the beginning of Carmen's liberation, because once she could see the pattern clearly, once she could recognize that she'd been cast in a role that existed before her and would exist after her if she played it, she could start making different choices, could start responding differently, could start protecting herself. Let me tell you about Sophia, who who was 45 when she finally set a boundary with her mother-in-law after 20 years of absorbing blame and criticism. And Sophia's boundary was simple but revolutionary. She said calmly and clearly, "I won't accept being blamed for things that aren't my responsibility." And her mother-in-law had stared at her in shock, in genuine shock, because daughters-in-law don't say things like that. Daughters-in-law don't name what's happening. Daughters-in-law absorb and apologize and try harder, and Sophia's refusal to play the role anymore created a crisis in the family system. But it also created space for something new, created the possibility that relationships could be based on reality rather than projection, on honesty rather than performance. Sophia described the weeks after she set that boundary as both terrifying and exhilarating. Terrifying because her mother-in-law raged and guilt-tripped and recruited other family members to tell Sophia she was being unreasonable, being difficult, being ungrateful, all the words that get used to punish women who refuse to be diminished. And exhilarating because Sophia felt something she hadn't felt in 2 decades. She felt free, felt like herself, felt like she could breathe fully. And her husband, who had been trained his whole life to prioritize his mother's feelings over everything else, had to make a choice, had to decide whether he would support his wife's right to be treated with respect or continue enabling his mother's need to control and blame. And that choice, that moment of decision, either strengthens a marriage or reveals that it was never really a partnership at all. When Carmen finally told Daniel how his mother's comment at the restaurant had affected her, when she finally stopped protecting him from the truth of his family's dynamics, Daniel's initial response was defensiveness, was minimization, was all the things that happen when someone is confronted with information that threatens their worldview. And he said things like, "She didn't mean it that way, and you're being too sensitive, and can't you just let it go?" And Carmen felt that familiar sinking feeling. That sense that she was alone in this, that even her husband, the person who was supposed to be her partner, her advocate, her safe place, was choosing his mother's comfort over Carmen's dignity. And she told me that was the moment she knew something had to change fundamentally, that she couldn't keep living in a marriage where her pain was negotiable, where her reality could be denied, where she was expected to endlessly accommodate someone else's dysfunction. But here's what happened next. What happened after Carmen stopped trying to convince Daniel and started simply stating her truth, started saying calmly and clearly, "I will no longer attend family gatherings where I'm treated with disrespect. I will no longer engage with your mother in situations where she uses me as a scapegoat. I will no longer pretend that what's happening isn't happening." And she didn't say it with anger or drama, didn't issue ultimatums. Just stated her boundaries as facts, as non-negotiable truths about how she would be treated. And Daniel had to sit with that, had to face the reality that his wife was serious, that she wasn't going to keep playing the role his family had assigned her. And slowly, very slowly, something shifted in him. Something that allowed him to start seeing what he'd been trained not to see, allowed him to start recognizing the patterns that had been invisible to him because they were so normalized. So much a part of the fabric of his family that they seemed like just the way things were. The work Daniel had to do was his own work, was the work of separating from his mother psychologically while still maintaining a relationship with her. The work of recognizing that his first loyalty was to his marriage, to the family he was creating with Carmen, not to the family he came from. And this is achingly difficult work for many people, especially for men who have been raised to believe that being a good son means never disagreeing with their mothers, never prioritizing their partners over their parents, never questioning the family script. And Daniel had to learn that protecting Carmen wasn't a betrayal of Victoria, that setting boundaries with his mother wasn't a rejection of her, that he could love both women without sacrificing one to appease the other. But it required him to get comfortable with his mother's discomfort, to stop managing her feelings, to let her be disappointed in him without collapsing or complying. Let me tell you about Miguel, who was 39 when he finally understood that his role as mediator between his wife and his mother was actually enabling the dysfunction, was allowing the pattern to continue. And Miguel had spent years trying to keep everyone happy, trying to explain each woman to the other, trying to smooth things over, trying to find compromises that somehow satisfied both. And what he finally realized was that this middle position was impossible, was a fantasy, was actually preventing any real change from happening, because true resolution required him to take a stance, To say clearly that his wife's emotional safety mattered more than his mother's need to control. To communicate to his mother that her behavior had consequences, that she couldn't treat his wife with disrespect and still expect him to show up as if nothing was wrong. Miguel told me that the hardest part was accepting that his mother might not change, might never acknowledge her role in the dynamic, might continue to see herself as the victim and his wife as the problem. And he had to grieve that, had to let go of the fantasy that he could create understanding between them, had to accept that sometimes love means protecting someone from another person's dysfunction, even when that other person is your mother. Even when it means your mother will feel hurt or angry or betrayed, because the alternative was sacrificing his marriage, watching his wife slowly disintegrate under the weight of constant blame and criticism, prioritizing his mother's emotional needs over his wife's basic dignity. From a neuroscience perspective, what happens in these situations is that our brains are trying to reconcile conflicting loyalties, trying to navigate between our attachment to our family of origin and our commitment to our chosen family. And both systems are activating powerful emotional responses. Both are connected to deep survival mechanisms. And when we're forced to choose, when we can no longer maintain the illusion that everyone can be satisfied, our nervous systems can go into overwhelm, can flood us with anxiety and guilt and fear. And this is why so many people stay stuck in these dynamics, because the discomfort of staying feels more manageable than the terror of choosing, the terror of potentially losing one relationship to preserve another. But what Carmen discovered, what so many women in her situation eventually discover, is that the cost of staying stuck is actually higher than the cost of change. That the slow erosion of your self-worth, the chronic stress of never being good enough, the loneliness of being unseen and undefended by your partner, all of that accumulates, all of that takes a toll on your health, your happiness, your sense of who you are. And at some point, if you're lucky, if you're paying attention, you reach a moment where you decide that your dignity is non-negotiable, where you recognize that you deserve better than to be someone's scapegoat, where you understand that real love doesn't require you to be small. Carmen started doing something that felt revolutionary to her. She started trusting her own perceptions, started validating her own experiences, started saying to herself that was inappropriate or that was hurtful or I don't deserve to be treated that way, instead of immediately questioning whether she was overreacting or being too sensitive. And this internal shift, this simple act of believing herself, changed everything. Because once she stopped trying to convince others that her reality was valid, once she stopped seeking external validation for what she knew to be true, she had access to her own power, her own clarity, her own authority. Let me tell you about Lucia, who was 51 when she looked back on 30 years of marriage and realized how much of herself she'd lost trying to be acceptable to her husband's family, how many opinions she'd suppressed, how many times she'd bitten her tongue, how often she'd made herself smaller to avoid conflict. And Lucia described this realization as both devastating and strangely freeing. Devastating because she mourned all those years, all that wasted energy, all that suppressed authenticity. And freeing because she finally gave herself permission to stop, to say enough, to reclaim her voice. And when she started speaking her truth, when she started showing up as her actual self rather than her carefully managed self, something surprising happened. Some of her husband's family members actually responded positively, actually seemed relieved that someone was finally breaking the silence, finally naming what everyone had felt but no one had. Lucia's story reveals something important about these family dynamics, which is that often the dysfunction serves multiple purposes, maintains multiple people in various roles. And when one person steps out of their assigned role, it creates space for others to step out of theirs too. It destabilizes the whole system in ways that can ultimately be healing, can ultimately allow for more authentic relationships, because the truth is that rigid family systems don't serve anyone well. They require everyone to perform, everyone to suppress their authentic selves to maintain the collective fiction, and that's exhausting for everyone, even for the people who seem to benefit from the arrangement, even for the mothers-in-law who get to maintain control at the cost of genuine connection, even for the husbands who avoid conflict at the cost of real intimacy. Carmen's healing didn't happen in one moment, didn't happen with one conversation or one boundary or one realization. It happened gradually, through repeated acts of self-protection, through learning to recognize when she was being blamed inappropriately and choosing not to accept it, through building a support system outside her husband's family, through finding a therapist who helped her understand the dynamics clearly, through joining a support group for daughters-in-law who were navigating similar situations. Through reading and learning and slowly reconstructing her sense of self, her sense of worth, her sense of what she deserved. She told me about a day, months after the restaurant incident, when Victoria made another blaming comment, something about Carmen's career affecting the family schedule, something that was clearly meant to criticize, to diminish, to put Carmen in her place. And Carmen looked at Victoria and felt, for the first time, not shame but something else. She felt a kind of detached clarity, a recognition that this comment said everything about Victoria and nothing about Carmen. And instead of defending herself, instead of explaining or justifying or apologizing, Carmen simply said, "That's an interesting perspective," and changed the subject. And she told me that Victoria looked confused, looked almost disappointed because the comment had been designed to provoke a reaction, to create an opportunity for Victoria to elaborate on Carmen's inadequacies. And when Carmen didn't take the bait, when Carmen refused to engage with the underlying blame, the moment passed, deflated. Powerless. This is what emotional maturity looks like. This ability to not react to provocation, to not personalize someone else's projection, to recognize that you're not responsible for managing another person's discomfort or validating their distorted reality. And it's not about being cold or dismissive, it's about being boundaried, it's about protecting your own emotional space. It's about refusing to participate in dynamics that diminish you. And Carmen had to practice this, had to learn it slowly. Had to sometimes fail at it and process her failures with compassion, had to build new neural pathways that supported this different way of being, because her old patterns were deeply ingrained, were backed by years of conditioning and fear and the desperate desire to belong. Let me tell you about Alina, Daniel's sister, who watched Carmen's transformation with fascination and something like envy. Because Alina had her own complicated relationship with Victoria, had spent her life trying to be the perfect daughter, trying to earn approval that was always conditional, always just out of reach, and seeing Carmen stop trying, stop performing, stop caring so much about Victoria's opinion, gave Alina a kind of permission she didn't know she needed. Showed her that it was possible to love someone and still protect yourself from them, to maintain a relationship while refusing to be diminished by it. And Alina started setting her own boundaries, started saying no more often, started living her life according to her own values rather than her mother's expectations. And Victoria struggled with this shift, struggled with losing the control she'd always had. But gradually, slowly, something in Victoria began to soften too. Began to recognize that maybe these rigid patterns weren't serving her either, weren't creating the close, loving family she actually wanted. This is the paradox of these dynamics, that the person who seems to benefit from the control and blame often doesn't actually benefit at all, often is as trapped as everyone else, trapped in a role that prevents genuine intimacy, that keeps her separated from the people she loves by walls of criticism and judgment. And Victoria's need to be right, to be central, to maintain power, was really a manifestation of her own fear, her own sense of inadequacy. Her own unprocessed grief about aging and changing and potentially becoming less important. And if Victoria had been able to acknowledge those feelings directly, if she'd had the emotional tools to grieve her losses and adapt to change, she wouldn't have needed to diminish Carmen, wouldn't have needed to create conflict to maintain connection. Carmen eventually invited Victoria to have coffee, just the two of them. And it was terrifying for Carmen, terrifying to sit across from this woman who had caused her so much pain. But Carmen had decided that she wanted to try one more time to see if a different kind of relationship was possible. And she told Victoria, gently but clearly, how Victoria's comments affected her, how the blame and criticism made it difficult for Carmen to want to spend time together. How Carmen genuinely wanted a better relationship but needed it to be based on mutual respect. And Victoria's first response was defensive, was a litany of justifications and counteraccusations and claims that Carmen was too sensitive. But Carmen didn't argue, didn't try to convince, just repeated calmly, "I understand that's how you see it, and I'm telling you how I experience it, and I need it to change if we're going to have a relation." Yeah. Victoria cried at that coffee shop, and it surprised both of them because Victoria rarely showed vulnerability, rarely let anyone see her pain, and through her tears Victoria said things she'd never said before, said how scared she'd been of losing Daniel when he got married, how inadequate she'd felt watching Carmen be young and successful and seemingly effortless at things Victoria had always struggled with, how she didn't know how to be a mother-in-law. Didn't know how to step back without feeling like she was being pushed aside, and Carmen listened and she felt something unexpected. She felt compassion, not the kind of compassion that erases boundaries or excuses behavior, but the kind of compassion that recognizes shared humanity, that sees another person's pain even while protecting yourself from their dysfunction. This conversation didn't fix everything, didn't erase years of hurt, didn't suddenly transform Victoria into a different person. But it opened a door, created a possibility that hadn't existed before, and over time, slowly, with setbacks and difficult moments and ongoing work, their relationship began to shift, began to be based less on roles and more on reality, less on blame and more on genuine connection, and Carmen learned that healing doesn't always mean cutting people out. Sometimes healing means staying in relationship while refusing to participate in the old patterns, while holding firm to your boundaries, while insisting on dignity even when it's uncomfortable for everyone. But Carmen also learned that some relationships can't be healed, that some people aren't willing or able to change. And she learned that it's okay to protect yourself, okay to limit contact, okay to choose your own well-being over someone else's comfort. And she learned that this isn't selfish or cruel, it's necessary, it's an act of self-love. It's a recognition that you matter, that your mental health matters, that you don't owe anyone access to you if that access is being used to harm you. And this knowledge, this permission she gave herself, was perhaps the most important part of her healing. The lunch where the cards declined happened 2 years ago now, and Carmen tells me that she barely recognizes the woman she was then, that frightened, people-pleasing woman who believed something was fundamentally wrong with her, who carried everyone else's anxiety like it was her job, who made herself small to fit into spaces that were never designed to accommodate her full self. And Carmen is different now, not because her circumstances have completely changed. Not because Victoria has become a different person, but because Carmen has changed, has grown into someone who trusts herself, who protects herself, who knows her worth isn't determined by someone else's approval or disapproval. She describes herself as less anxious now, less reactive, more grounded, and neuroscience would explain this as her nervous system recalibrating, as her amygdala learning that she's not actually in danger every time there's family contact, as new neural pathways forming that support self-protection rather than self-abandonment, as her body learning that it's safe to take up space, safe to have needs, safe to exist without constantly monitoring for threat. And this recalibration happens through repeated experiences of setting boundaries and surviving the discomfort, through building evidence that you can protect yourself, through learning that other people's anger or disappointment won't destroy you. Carmen's marriage is different too. Stronger in some ways, more honest, more equal, because Daniel had to grow up in certain fundamental ways, had to learn to see his mother clearly, had to accept that his loyalty to his wife wasn't a betrayal of his mother, had to get comfortable with his mother's discomfort. And this growth was painful for him, was threatening to his sense of identity, but it was necessary. It was the only way his marriage could survive, and he tells Carmen now that he's grateful. That he sees how trapped he was in those old patterns, how much they cost both of them, how much richer their life is now that they're living in reality rather than performance. Let me tell you about how this story ends, or rather how it continues, because these stories don't really end. They evolve, they shift, they open into new chapters, and Carmen is now working with other women who are navigating similar dynamics, sharing what she learned, offering support and witnessing and validation. And she tells me that the greatest gift she can give another woman is the simple statement: "You're not crazy, you're not too sensitive, what's happening is real, and you deserve better." Because that's what she needed to hear, that's what finally allowed her to start healing, this permission to trust her own perceptions, to value her own experience, to believe that her dignity mattered. She tells me about a woman named Rosa who came to one of Carmen's support groups. And Rosa was exactly where Carmen had been 2 years ago, caught in the same web of blame and self-doubt and desperate people-pleasing. And Carmen watched Rosa tell her story, watched her cry and apologize for crying and minimize her own pain. And Carmen said to her gently, "What if you're not the problem? What if you've never been the problem? What if you just walked into a system that needed someone to blame? And you were available." And she watched something shift in Rosa's face, watched her sit up a little straighter, watched her take a deeper breath. And Carmen recognized that shift because she'd felt it herself. That moment when you first consider the possibility that maybe, just maybe, you're not fundamentally flawed. The work of healing from these dynamics is the work of coming home to yourself, of reclaiming the parts of you that got suppressed or denied or criticized into silence, of learning to be your own advocate, your own protector, your own champion. And it's the work of grieving too, grieving the family you thought you'd have, the acceptance you thought you'd receive, the belonging you thought was possible. And it's the work of building something new, something based on your own values, your own vision, your own definition of what family and love and loyalty actually mean. Carmen tells me that she thinks about that lunch sometimes, about the moment when those cards declined and Victoria's blame landed on her like a verdict. And she tells me that she can feel grateful for it now, not because it wasn't painful, not because it didn't hurt, but because it was the crack that let the light in. It was the moment that made the invisible visible. It was the catalyst that forced her to start seeing clearly, to start questioning, to start choosing herself. And she tells me that she wouldn't go back, wouldn't trade the person she is now for the false peace she had then, wouldn't choose comfort over truth, wouldn't choose approval over dignity. This is what freedom looks like. This ability to look back at your pain and recognize it as your teacher. This capacity to hold both the hurt and the gratitude, to acknowledge what was lost while celebrating what was gained, to see yourself as the author of your own story rather than a character in someone else's narrative. And Carmen has claimed that authority, has stepped into her own life fully, has learned that love without respect isn't really love at all. That family that requires you to diminish yourself isn't really family. That belonging at the cost of your authenticity is just another form of exile. The cards declined that day. And in some strange way, so did Carmen's willingness to keep playing a role that was killing her slowly. So declined her tolerance for being blamed for things that weren't her responsibility. So declined her belief that she had to earn her place, had to prove her worth, had to accept whatever treatment was given to her. And that declination, that refusal, that quiet revolution that started in a restaurant on a spring afternoon, became the foundation of her healing. Became the beginning of her reclamation, became the moment she started finding her way back to herself.